You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast. I am your host, Billy Galenko, and we are here with a very exciting episode today. We have special guest Marc Hochar of Château Musar on the podcast with us. We have been working to have Château Musar on the podcast since Bartholomew Broadbent first mentioned them many years ago. I know we've brought them up multiple times, and we're really excited to have Marc on to discuss both the Chateau and their wines. But before we get to that interview, we have a couple interesting articles for the news this week. The first article I want to touch on is titled, "To Find the Best German Wine, Look for the Grape Eagle." When I first started studying for the sommelier exams, even the intro exam, before I knew anything about wine, one of the first things I learned about was the VDP. It's this organization in Germany. The actual full German name is very long. It is Verband Deutscher Produktweinguter. What's easier to remember, number one, is VDP, and number two, it is these grape eagles. Basically, on the neck of every bottle that is part of the VDP, you'll see this eagle, and in between that will be 6 dots in the shape of a triangle, which is meant to replicate a bunch of grapes. This association of Germany's top estates is basically an organization that is committed to producing the highest quality wines. They're held to certain standards, and they're basically some of the top wines in all of Germany. I will say not all of the top wines in Germany are part of the VDP, but it's very hard to go wrong. If you find a wine with the eagle on the neck of its bottle, you basically are going to have a really high quality, well-made wine. And to go, part of that is building off of Don Hoff, our interview last week. They are part of the VDP, and this just gives you a little bit more insight into what the organization does, the different tiers of their wines, their different classifications of Cabernet, Spätlese, Auslese, and so on. And I just thought it was a really great, approachable article in Food and Wine that everybody should check out. So we have a link to that on the Vint Wine News or Vint Marketplace Wine News for last week, and everybody should go check. I think it's like the best way to easily get into German wine is just look for the eagle on the neck of the bottle, and you'll be set with a great bottle of wine. There's a bunch of wines that qualify for VDP wines depending on the region. So you will see some producers also have Spätburgunder or Pinot Noir, for example. So just keep a lookout for the eagle, regardless of color. It's almost a guarantee to be a quality bottle of wine. The next article is something that, again, nerdy, but really piques my fancy, is that Tablas Creek has officially made history with Châteauneuf-du-Pape grapes. Wine aficionados may be familiar with the fact that Châteauneuf-du-Pape can be made with 13 grapes, both white and red. And now Tablas Creek up in Paso Robles has made a wine, has planted not only all of the varieties, it has made a single varietal wine out of each of the varieties that were planted. This year is the final wine to add to their portfolio. It was Muscardin. It was the final wine that they needed. You will notice that the article says 14 wines that they've made. And, a lot of you might be saying, how is that possible? Well, the rules in Châteauneuf-du-Pape actually count Grenache and Grenache Blanc, so Grenache Noir and Grenache Blanc, as one grape. So if you were to plant them both separately, which Tablas Creek has, you end up with 14 wines because Grenache is basically just one variety when it comes to the rules and regulations of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So that is very exciting. Everybody should go check out some of these single variety wines. Their expression, obviously, it's not exactly the same as they would be in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but up there, the Paso Robles and Tablas Creek is up there in the mountains a little bit. So you get a really cool expression of these varieties, and I highly recommend also visiting the winery. It's a really nice visit, really cool and educational. But if you can't, just tasting the wines is a great way to get to know the winery and the varieties. All right. Well, that is the news for this week, and we can get to our extremely exciting interview with Marc Hochar. It is a great wide-ranging interview, and we cover a wide swath of both their history, approaches to their winemaking, the different varieties that they work with, spanning stuff like Obaideh, which is a native Lebanese variety, and some of the other native varieties that they work with are indigenous varieties, as well as some of the quote unquote international varieties that, they've been grown there for a long period of time. So some of them have just really acclimated in a unique way to the Lebanese climate. Some of them are a little newer that they're working to plant because of climate change. But we cover all sorts of winemaking and viticulture talk, and it's really a special conversation. And part of the fun is even just diving into what is Château Musar in terms of a wine. How do you describe it? He has a really interesting part about how early on in its life, a lot of Château Musar are put in flights of red Bordeaux, whereas later in their lives, they're put in flights of Burgundy and kind of blend in there. So they go from younger and more powerful to very complex and graceful and elegant wines as they age, and both their reds and their whites age exceptionally. So this was a very special treat for us to have Marc on the podcast, and we're really excited to share the Château Musar story with you. So without further ado, here is Marc Hochar of Château Musar.
Hey, Marc, we're thrilled to have you join us today. Thanks so much.
I'm happy to be here. There's a lot to talk about with Musar, so I'm sure it should be an interesting conversation for everybody.
Well, and here in the States, I'm not sure how it is in Europe, or obviously as you get closer down to Lebanon, but you either know Mussar and love it, or you just don't know at all. And so maybe for some of our listeners, tell us about Château Musar. It was founded by your grandfather. Is that correct? In the 20s or 30s? Maybe you can tell us about some of the history.
Yeah. So Musar was started indeed, by Gaston Hochar. So that's the name of my grandfather. He started in 1930, just after World War I. Lebanon was a new country at the time, just born out of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. And actually, he tried to study medicine in France. We're Lebanese, so he went from Lebanon to France to study. He came back really loving wine and not really liking medicine. And fell in love with wines, and then decided to start a winery in 1930. At the time, the French army was posted in many of the Levant area or Levant countries, so including Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. And they wanted wine, so that was also a direct possibility to sell wines to the French at the time, but also start selling wines also obviously to the Lebanese, and that's how it started. And I think for the first 20-25 years, a lot of the sales went through to the French army. And gradually, eventually, my father and my uncle started to work also in the business in the late 50s. And that's when my father really took over the winemaking and changed a little bit how we make things. But I guess we'll talk about it when we talk about the wines later on. But at least that's the history of where we started.
What are some of the most memorable tastings you've had, or maybe experiences? I don't know if it's when you're with Bartholomew. I feel like Bartholomew Broadbent had so many exciting stories about Mussar, and he was showing the people, and the reaction that he got was amazing because, they were a lineup of all these first growths. Have you ever had one of these like really memorable times where you're tasting people on Mussar and they're just mind blown, or something that really stood out to you?
I've had many, and I have a lot of stories, to be honest. I have stories of people who I've met at tastings who told me I changed my life because of Mussar. One gentleman was studying as a nurse, had a bottle of 95 Reds, and then was his epiphany wine. It just clicked. It started to understand wine in a different way, not just as a liquid to drink, but as actually more as an experience and a journey with every bottle. And he became a sommelier, and so Mussar was what made him change his life. I've had a tasting in Atlanta, BC, so before COVID, where we were showing like an older white. I think it was 89 white, and these whites are so peculiar, so different. They hit completely different flavor profile compared to any other wines. And you had this woman who started having tears in her eyes, and and it brought out emotions. And this is what wine is about. I don't see it again as a liquid to drink. It's not the quantities. It's really the quality of just hitting that right sweet spot of connecting with memories, with experiences that you've had through what you're tasting. And this is what wine can do that I think no other alcohol can do. It's because it hits so many different, palettes in terms of the flavor. And so, yes, when you have somebody in front of you who starts really tearing up because of the wine that they're tasting, it's beautiful. Another memorable memory was I was tasting with my father at the time, and we opened 2 bottles of 81 red, beautiful vintage of Mussar. And so we had a 2-hour conversation on which bottle was the best. And the 2 bottles were evolving at their own pace. He preferred one at the beginning. I preferred another one. And so we spent 2 hours. And as the wines were evolving, he was trying not to switch too many times between the wines because, he had made them. And so he had his own opinion. But I was going back and forth. And, maybe at the beginning, one wine appealed more to me, one bottle, sorry. Half an hour later, the other one seemed to have taken over. An hour later, it seemed to have changed again. And so it's this dynamic that was completely, unexpected for me. And then it was like 25 years ago that I was having this tasting with him to show you that, just 2 bottles of the same wine, they're different. Some people will say, it means one is better than the other. It's not true. It's not that one is better. They're just different and they give you a different journey and a different path. And it's up to each one of us to decide which one is the right one for them, or ideally both, because with both you learn even more from wine.
I think that's amazing. Also, that really goes to show like your style of winemaking and how it's vintage to vintage is different, but wine to wine and even bottle to bottle has its own personality, and they are truly like alive and evolving, and they're not just this set chemically set thing.
Yeah, for some people, to be honest, is maybe not what they look for. Some people look for consistency, for the same experience, for I'm going to go back to a certain wine and then just taste exactly the same. Fair, I get it. For some people who like that, that's fine. For us, we want adventure, we want life, we want something that's evolving, we want an experience that changes. And that's what you get with a bottle of Mussar. Every bottle will be different, but it's not a repeat. It's a new journey.
Positionally, you guys it's just north and maybe just a little bit east of Beirut. Is that correct?
So the winery, when my grandfather started, he didn't have any money. So he started basically with vats that were built into the cellars of a very old castle or convent called actually the Mussar convent or the Mussar Palace. And this is where the name Mussar comes from. Okay. And that was just located north of Beirut in the mountains, around 400 meters of altitude. But the vineyards themselves were in the Bekaa Valley, which is much more east of Beirut, up in the mountains, between the 2 mountain ranges, Mount Lebanon and Mount Anti-Lebanon. And so the vineyards themselves are roughly a 3.5 hour truck drive from the winery, which is close to the coastline.
I see. Okay. And right there around the winery, I see that the topography gets up to maybe 700-800 meters. Is that correct? And then out in the Bekaa Valley, what kind of elevation do we see around the vineyards?
So in the vineyards, which is the most important part, we are roughly at 900 meters or 1,000 meters, depending on exactly where you are in the Bekaa Valley, whereas the winery is at 400 meters of altitude, so much, much lower. But there are basically no vines around the winery. So if you come, it's within a village. We just actually planted one vine at the entrance, just to make a point that it is a business linked to wines and to vines. But apart from that, because we are in the village itself and it's fairly hilly there, there's absolutely there are no vineyards around our winery. In the vineyards themselves that are in the Bekaa Valley, you are at, let's say, 900 to 1,000 meters of altitude. But mostly you're surrounded by 2 chains of mountains running north to south. These mountains go up to 3,000 meters, so 2,000 meters more than the Bekaa Valley floor, which means that when you're in the Bekaa Valley, you're protected from the heat coming from the desert in Syria to our east, because there's a chain of mountain that goes up 2,000 meters on that side. And then to the west, you're protected from the humidity that comes from the Mediterranean Sea, because again, there's 2,000 meters of mountains to your west. In the summer, for example, when it gets really hot on the coastline and then evaporation happens from the sea, you get some clouds that build up. They go up the sides of the mountain but they never cross into the Bekaa Valley because it's just so high. And so that's really why I think the terroir in that area in the Bekaa Valley is amazing, because you don't get that humidity. That's really a problem for vines, because humidity brings pests, brings problems, brings issues. And so we're blessed from that perspective with that terroir.
Yeah, can you just talk about maybe more aspects of the terroir in terms of the soil and what sort of maybe unique influence that you get from the terrain there, as well as any, you mentioned some of the climatic effects. You have the mountain ranges on either side protecting from the humidity and from the dry heat. But what changes maybe too have you seen that have affected the way that you experience weather in the valley?
Oh, well, it's been a roller coaster for the last 15 years, to be honest, much more so than in the past. And I think it's generally due to global warming. Because of the altitude that we have snow in the winter.
Yeah.
We actually have skiing in Lebanon. People don't think of us.
Well, 1,000 meters, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah. So 3,000 meters, that's 10,000 feet. Yeah. So we do get some skiing, and we do get some snow in the vineyards themselves it depends, 2 to 3 weeks a year, depends when there's a storm or not. And because we do not irrigate, we really rely on rainfall and snow to build up all the water reserves below our vineyards, which is where all the vines will have to actually source their water needs throughout the season until harvest, which happens in August and September. And usually it doesn't rain from April onwards. So it's really the winter that's the most important part in terms of building up these water resources. And then that's it. And then the vines have to struggle on their own and manage. But the soil is mainly a limestone base throughout the valley. In the middle of the valley, there's a river, so there's more water there. Our vineyards are located closer to the foothills of the mountains on the western side of the Bekaa Valley. There you have a little bit, obviously a limestone base. You have roughly a meter high of clay and limestone, but you have less water coming from the river. You really have water underneath. And so what it means is that you end up with, dry farming with not much water, which means lower yields. And we actually have to plant fairly wide rows because we want to make sure that all the vines have enough water. If we plant them too tight, then many of them won't make it because there won't be enough water for all of them. But that's part of the approach that we have to really concentrate a little bit, I guess, the flavors that you get from the vines. When you have low yields, it's like extreme pruning. You just get much more concentration into the flavors and the aromatics that you can get out of your fruit. So that's how we do it, and it's all bush vines, also, by the way. So nothing on trellises. Trellises, if you're irrigating, at least in Lebanon. If you're not irrigating, basically all of your grapes are going to be burnt. So we rely on the canopy of just bush vines for all of our vineyard. So it's a lot of work, obviously, because it's all done manually. You can't do anything with machines, no picking, none of the hard work. Yeah, so it's all manual work, the old school way.
Yeah. Well, let's give our listeners then a sense of maybe the scale. How much do you have planted there, and then the average age of vines, assuming you have old vine, but also maybe some newer plantings. But share that with us.
Yeah, so we harvest on a total of 200 hectares.
Oh, okay.
I think that's around 450 acres.
Yeah, about that. Yep,
about that size. So it's big. That's big. It's big. It's not small.
Yes,
it's big enough. It depends, big compared to what? I mean, compared to Australia, it's tiny. Compared to Chile, it's tiny. Compared to France, Burgundy, it's huge. And so, it depends on your benchmark. But I guess what's important is not necessarily the surface area. It's mostly the number of bottles that we produce given that size. And actually, we are at roughly 600,000 bottles a year produced out of these 450 acres. And so that's roughly like a 40% production in terms of yields compared to what I would call probably a more normal wine growing area. And this is crucial in terms of creating this intensity in the flavors and in the aromatics that we get in our wines.
So stay there for a little bit. is that mainly constraints in terms of how you're pruning and maybe the age of vines that's producing that type of yield? Is it just like really tight grape selection, a combination of both? What drives the lower yield and obviously higher concentration and quality?
Yeah. So the first driver is the wide plantings that we have because we have just little water. So that's going to be for the first biggest driver. The second is pruning, and it depends on the years, depends really on the type of vine and varietal. But basically we don't pick particularly some juice versus others or some grapes versus others. We just pick everything, and everything goes into our wines. We don't have a selection process because we believe that if it's the vintage, it's the vintage, and anything that comes with the vintage should be in there. So that's the philosophy that we have. And it's probably a bit more difficult to work that way, especially when, as we don't use yeast for fermentation. So if you have some green parts on your vines, will you include them? In our case, yes, we would include them. Obviously not if it's not a huge ratio, but we usually pick based on sugar levels. Then it's on average, we do take everything, even overripe and underripe parts, within a bunch. Obviously, not if it's a whole bunch that's overripe or underripe, that wouldn't work. But if it's within the bunch, then everything would go in there. And in terms of the age of the vines, and just making sure I cover all your questions, so we always plant because we're adding new vineyards. So the youngest would be 3-4 years old. On average, we're probably around 30-40 years. Our oldest reds are around 65-70 years. And our oldest whites, but these are really, we're starting to lose them because the yields are so low. They're not even planted in our own land. And the yields being so low, eventually the farmers start to take them out, are more than 120 and 130 years old. And these are for the white varietals that are local to Lebanon and that we use in our Château Musar white. So that's Obaideh and Merwah, these two white varietals.
I wanted to follow up on something you said there. When you said you don't use yeast, you guys don't inoculate with yeast. It's just some of the native yeasts from the area. Have you guys done any trials trying to use inoculated yeast at any time just to see what it would be like? Or have you always just left it with the natural?
So probably at the time of my grandfather, I would imagine that when he started, he had no clue what would work. And so I imagine that he probably used yeasts. So we're talking 30s to late 50s. When my father came in, his whole approach, he basically almost kicked out my grandfather at the time. He told him, okay, if you want me to help you make the wines, I'll make them, myself, basically my own way. And from then on, he basically followed a bit the path or the philosophy that was born out of the wine trade of the Phoenicians and the production from the Phoenicians dating back to 6,000 years ago in Lebanon. And that's really the part where we used to produce a lot of wine in the area and export it with the Phoenicians and they trade across the Mediterranean. And they probably did not use yeast. The approach of my father was, okay, they've been making wines for 6,000 years. Why do we use yeast? So he stopped completely. And from the late 50s onwards, we stopped using them. Have we started again or tested again? No, not at all. And it's been part of our philosophy. We not toyed with the idea, but we tried to think about everything. And, one of them was whether we would use existing yeasts and then just, create a starter yeast from our existing yeasts in a particular year and then apply them for the following year if there was an issue in the fermentation the following year. But we haven't done it. It would be a big step for us in terms of not following a completely natural process. And unless there's a real big issue, and we have difficult years where it's difficult for the wines to start fermentation on their own, but we've always managed. But if it becomes a real big problem because of very high alcohol levels or sugar levels that stop fermentation on a very consistent basis, then maybe we'll consider it. But for the moment, no, we stick to our guns, even though it's very difficult. I shouldn't say we stick to our guns because in this part of the world, it's really also might be misinterpreted, but we stick to our let's say, our philosophy. That's probably more appropriate.
So you guys let each individual lot ferment on its own? Or do you use like a pied de cuve and once it starts going, then you start putting that in each to get it going?
No. So every vat will be different. Every plot of land will be different. Every varietal will be different. And so they will all start on their own unless, and we would use your technique, the technique you mentioned, which is to put some wine into a half vat that is already starting if the other half in another part of in another vat was not starting. We use it. It's rare. We do it, but we wouldn't do it systematically. So the base case is always every vat on its own, every yeast on its own, every natural yeast on its own, etc. That's the basic premise.
Well, Marc, you made reference to you made reference to the varieties that you are growing down there, and many of our listeners will be much familiar with, especially the red varieties that you're working with, but some of the whites maybe not so much. Can you walk through what you're most predominantly growing and your philosophy, blending and such?
On the reds or on the whites, or both?
Yeah, let's do the reds first, and then go to the whites.
Yeah, let's do the reds. When my grandfather started, there had been phylloxera, I think, in Lebanon. If there were any vines, and we don't know what there was before then, they didn't make it, at least not in the Bekaa Valley. Actually, the only ones that survived were in the mountain hills, and these are the two white varietals that we use, Obaideh. But so on the reds, he had to plant. And when there was wine that came back to the Lebanon area in the 1850s, it was mostly monks who started planting, and they followed a little bit the path of what Algeria had done. Algeria was under French control at the time, and they planted, because of the heat in Algeria, mostly Rhone varietals. And then eventually that came to Lebanon. And so when my grandfather started, he did the same. Because he had studied in France and knew some varietals there from having tasted wines there, he turned to France. It made more sense. We also speak French, in Lebanon. So it was a logical step. And so he planted mostly varietals that would resist to heat. And so that was either south of France or Chateau, mainly. Mm-hmm. We have also Syrah. We have also a bit of Flash. And I think he also added Cabernet Sauvignon, because during the first 20 years at the winery, I don't think Cabernet was there at the beginning, but eventually he became friends with Ronald Barton from Chateau Léoville-Barton, and they had a close friendship, even though Ronald Barton did not work with us, but just was there, I think, as part of the Irish army, if I remember well, even though he had a chateau in France. And he basically probably was the influence towards my grandfather starting also to plant a bit of Cabernet. I assume. This is all history that dates back to a long time ago. And this is what we know of that story. And so we always use these red varietals, and mostly as blends. We always build the balance, the harmony of our wines with different components. I call it almost building your wines like you play Lego. You basically use different varietals, different plots of lands, different age of vines to create the best balance, because every single one of these items will bring in a new factor, a new complexity or diversity to the wine, whether it's the age, the terroir, silty soils, more limestone soils, more gravelly soils. All of these will bring in something a bit different. And rather than going the path of, let's say, Germany, for example, that would take one wine per small plot of land and really try to express the soil of that particular plot, even if it's very small, we would tend to go the other way of trying to blend as best as we can. We produce obviously slightly bigger volumes then as a result per wine, but the idea is that it has more complexity because you've really built up on the diversity of all your different varietals and land. And so this is how we do it for the reds. And then every one of our labels has a slightly different blend. Usually there's always Chateau, which is what I call the Pinot Noir of the South. It's the most elegant, it's the most smooth, silky, transparent, more lighter bodied, beautiful wine. I know people are used in the US to more heavier, bolder wines, but Chateau is an absolute marvel in Lebanon. But then we combine it with Cabernet, because Cabernet then gives you the body. And so you're really combining, I guess, the more masculine Cabernet with the more feminine Chateau. And they complement themselves, each other very, very well. And then we add a third varietal that bridges between these two. And that third varietal changes depending on the wine that you have or depending on the label that you have. So for our top red, it's Cabernet and Chateau with our Mussar Jeune, which is our entry level, would have Cabernet and Chateau with Syrah. And so that third varietal really brings in a particular identity to each wine. We actually have 4 wines. So the third varietal that changes is either Carignan or Syrah for another wine, or Grenache for another wine, or Tempranillo for another wine. And Tempranillo was planted actually not too long ago, 15 years ago, because of the impact of global warming. And we're looking for varietals that have this ability to resist to heat. And so that's a new wine we added called Levantine. Really beautiful wine if you have the opportunity to taste it.
I feel like there are people who are either like the most hardcore people, or I'm a Burgundy person or I'm a Bordeaux person, and they tend to not veer out. Which one of those have you had more success winning over to the Mussar way?
Oh, that's a very good question. I would say when our wines are young, they tend to be a bit more full-bodied. That's normal. And maybe the Cabernet sometimes shines a bit more. And so you end up with, let's say, Mussar wines being included in blind tastings with Bordeaux wines, mostly when they're younger. And I say young in Mussar terms, we're talking 7 years to 20 years. Beyond that, they are sometimes put with Bordeaux, but more often either with Rhone or sometimes with Burgundy. Because as they get older, the sensorial component starts to kick in even more, as in it loses some of this concentration. It becomes much more ethereal, lighter body, lighter color, much more earthy. And whereas Cabernet tends to stay on the fruit very, very long, Cinsault and Carignan don't. They move to earth. And all of a sudden, that takes on some notes from different regions that are not at all Bordeaux. So you could put a Bordeaux in a blind taste, Mussar in a blind tasting when it's young. But what I've seen also is, I was talking about this person who was a nurse and really became a sommelier afterwards. Well, he then won a sommelier award, another award, like a prize. And that included a visit to a very famous Burgundy house in France. After 3 days of tasting all the Burgundies, eventually they had a blind tasting, 4 wines. And the question was, which one was not a Burgundy wine? And he guessed it because it was his Epiphany wine, the 95 Mussar. But he guessed wrong. It was 94, not 95. But he guessed, the winery. And so we were put in a Burgundy blind tasting after 25 years in terms of age of the bottle. So you really get both. And this is why Mussar is a bit of a chameleon in terms of that sense. And although we release the wines at 7 years and they are ready to drink at 7 years, they only, in my opinion, get better with time and move away from that pure fruit and then move to something completely different over time. And this is the beautiful part of where our wines get to. On the whites, for the Chateau white, which is a top label, we use 2 local varietals, Obaideh and very unique varietals. They ripen very late after the reds. So we harvest them actually in October. So it's almost like a late harvest. But because they are local, they are adapted to terroir, to the heat. They ripen very, very slowly. They get to alcohol levels of 12 and a half maximum, despite the very late harvest. And because they've spent so much time on the vine, you end up with wines that have an extreme complexity, very, very unusual, very unique. I know probably some of your drinkers or your listeners will have heard of Château Musar Reds. Usually when I get a tasting and somebody comes in for a tasting and says, I know the reds, we're going to taste the whites also. Okay, so let's try those. They are surprised, shocked, but in a good way, because they really behave in a completely different way to many, many other wines. They behave like our reds, actually, or like a red wine. We treat them like a red wine. We age them like a red wine. We actually release them after 7 years, and they age decades like our reds. So it's really an unusual white, and one that people usually remember a lot when they have a tasting, especially if we include all the vintages. It's a unique animal. I would call it an animal rather than anything else.
Do you think it's that long hang time and the really mature and developed phenolics that allow it to live that long, or I guess that combined with the acid and however you guys mature it as well?
It's a very good question. I think in wine in general, everything is a combination of a million different things that happen in the terroir itself, in the climate that year, in the varietals that you use. in the process at the winery, a process or no process in our case, but just like tending to the wines. This is what I would call it, the natural fermentation. So it's a combination of everything. The acidity is there and it remains even though we're harvesting in October for these varietals. So there is acidity, and it's a combination of this and probably this very long maturation process on the vine that probably leads to their aging ability. It's difficult to know. It's like life. How does a body work? A body of a person. Why does blood flow in one way and not the other? It's just that's the way it is. It's who those varietals are, and we just have to make sure that we tend to the wines in order to preserve that ability of that juice to age, and not treat it and strip it of anything that would hamper its ability to live as long as our whites do.
That makes a lot of sense, and they are fantastic and transcendent wines. I think, I've been lucky enough to have both of them, and I guess I would call them Grand Van, but your top wines, and they are distinctly unique and amazing. But I do want to ask, so when you have your other reds, and I don't know, I think you have a second label for your whites as well. Have you purposely thought about, having some intro levels wines so that people can get to know Mussar and graduate up to your top wines, or are those just meant to be other expressions of your vineyards and not meant to really be an intro in any way, one way or the other?
No, it's a good question. For the reds, they are blends always. We always have the Sasso and the Cabernet. So in our entry level called Mussar Jeune, the third varietal that I was talking about earlier is the Syrah. And so it's close, it's not the same obviously, but you have Sasso and Cabernet as well in the Chateau label. So they're close enough, the reds, in terms of how they behave, even though we're switching one varietal for another in one case. For the whites, it's very different. Our Mussar Jeune white, which is our entry level, used to be made out of Obaideh, one of the two varietals, the local varietals. And what we realized was that the wines were very austere when they were young. The Chateau white we sell after 7 years. You can't do this with your entry level wine. The entry level wine has to be a wine that you release after a year or 2 years. And also, we were selling much more outside of Lebanon. We're talking 15, 20 years ago. And so we needed an entry wine that was accessible, understandable, and that also in terms of varietals that we use would basically not scare people. Because you want your younger audience to say, okay, if you're launching an entry-level wine, you want people to be easy and comfortable ordering it. Now, if they come to a restaurant and they want to order, okay, can I have this obscure name of a varietal coming from Lebanon that I've never heard of before? And, it's a bit more difficult. So what we did was we changed the blend on the entry-level wines to Vermentino Chardonnay. Unusual blend, because we always like to have wines that have a very strong identity, that are very unique to us. The idea is not of, doing another Chardonnay compared to the 1,000 Chardonnays that are already out there, or millions of Chardonnays that are out there. So we wanted an identity that was unique to us. So we created that blend of 3 varietals, but we used varietals that people would be comfortable and more familiar with. And that, for an entry level, I think makes sense, because it gets people to cross that bridge into a new region. At least they recognize the varietals. If it's a new region, a new name, a new varietal, then it's more difficult, I guess, to get people hooked on it.
That makes a lot of sense, and that is a really unique blend. I think I haven't had one with all of those components, but I think each of them offers something that would be perfect together. So I think that's a smart idea. Yeah, go ahead.
Again, it's like playing Lego, as I was saying earlier, like the building, and you're building the balance of your wines. And so the Chardonnay would give you the butteriness that you need on the structure on the palate. The Viognier and the Vermentino each give you different types of aromatics, but then combined. So it just works. It just gives you something that's different from the rest, granted, but this is what makes it special, but also very, very balanced.
That makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask how your wines are perceived as you go into new emerging markets. So we had Michael Broadbent put you guys on the map in terms of the global wine scene. And I think his son Bartholomew's done a great job of being a proponent here in the US. When you're moving into markets like Asia, or even down in maybe Australia or South America, How do you guys talk about Mussar? Is it just here's something that's completely unique? Do you lean into Lebanon? How do you first present such a unique style of wine and to a new market?
It's a very good question because we are still developing a few markets. I was in Armenia, for example, a few days ago, which is a completely new market for us. Well, you have to we lean on the history of the region because people don't know the region. When you come into a place and people have never heard about Lebanon, I think just to explain that there have been wines in Lebanon or in the region for 6,000 years. So this is not new to the terroir in terms of planting grapes here. And then second, the identity specific to Mussar as to why is Mussar different. When you introduce Mussar as a new brand, we usually always focus on the Chateau because this has been the driver. This is what the identity of the brand and the taste and the flavor profile we've built and the ageability of the wines. This is what usually impresses people. When you're tasting a wine just released and happens to be 7 years old, that's something. When you start to taste something that's 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, all of a sudden, the perception of what this wine can be for somebody who's new to that wine is very different. If you come into a restaurant and you see a wine, let's say a 5-year-old wine, your perception of that wine is something. And if you see a vertical of 5 vintages going back to 30 years from that same wine, all of a sudden, you say, okay, the more expensive ones are the older ones that fare. I can drink maybe the younger one and see where it evolves or eventually taste an older one later on. So it gives a different perspective. And so in new markets, this is what we try to explain because this is one of the really differentiating factors of Mussar. But also then we have to introduce the younger wines that are probably closer to what people would know already, depending on where they come from, depending on whether they're used to particular varietals that we have in our blends or not. But it's more of a challenge. What's the locomotive, as you say in French? The engine is really the Chateau wines. And then when you get to the whites, then people are completely crazy. They go crazy because they just don't get it at the beginning. And then this is why we usually try to have formats where we introduce our wines, which are proper seminars, as in an hour and a half. Because through that process, you really start to get to people. They start to understand the message. They taste different wines. They see how they evolve over an hour and a half of tasting. And it's through that process that they really start to get what Mussar is about. Particularly for the whites. If you just taste the white over 30 seconds, you probably, either you get it straight away, but I would say probably 90% of the people would not get it. And they would need another half an hour, 1 hour just to really get to understand those wines. And then probably most of them or many of them will be hooked. It's just that it's a slow process of introducing our wines because they are so different, particularly for the wines. It was a very long-winded answer to your question, but hopefully a complete one.
That's great. I want to make sure that we don't pass over the Rosé wine that you make, which is fairly sought after. Can be hard to find, at least in our parts. What's the reception of that wine? What's the idea behind it?
Yes. So we have 2 rosés. We have the Mussar Jeune Rosé, which is our entry level. That's probably the closest type of blend and wine compared to other rosé wines in the world. It's really it's mainly Sasso with a bit of Mourvèdre. So it's a rosé made out of red grapes, the usual way. It's actually a blend of press and saignée and bleeding methods just to control color and taste. But it's made with the same juice, as in the same small yields that we were talking about for the reds and the whites, which come across as low yields across all of our vineyards. So you have much more intense flavors because of that. Not because necessarily of the longer maceration time, but just because you have less yields and therefore much more concentration in the juice flavors themselves. Now, on the rosé of Chateau Rosé, that's a completely different animal again. We're talking about a wine which is made from Obaideh and Merwah, which are 2 white varietals. And we actually add around 3% of Sasso red grapes. And they are all crushed together. Once we crush all of that, we take the juice, put it into barrels, ferment, and then eventually within a year it's bottled. So it's really our Chateau Rosé is what I call a white in disguise, because 97% is white grapes. So it behaves a little bit like our white wine, our white premium wine, which means that it ages beautifully. Now we release it after, now we were on 2018 vintage, so that's 7 years old. We're now moving to 2020. We produce it every 2 years, but we started producing it in 94, and we still open bottles of 94 and 95. And it's like a white, it has this ability to just withstand time. And so if I give you a rosé of Château Musar Rosé 2008, 2006, you'll be astounded by the freshness that you still have there. Now, to be honest, because people are not used to aging rosés so much, we don't have a library of our Chateau Rosé like we would have for our Chateau White or Chateau Red. So we sell through a vintage and then we move on. But obviously, at the winery, we still have a few bottles. So if you tend to visit, we can open a few older bottles, but we don't sell them actively anymore as they get older. Although they can withstand that time. That's again, the surprise of those two varietals, the two white ones.
So you were saying you use both saignée and press. So are you like bleeding some off earlier and then you're pressing at the end, or how does that work?
No. So the saignée and the press go into the Mussar jeune.
Ah, yes.
Which is the red grapes for Cinsault and Mourvèdre. And the reason we combine both methods and then blend them is if we only do press, we don't have enough taste. Mm-hmm. We feel that we don't have enough color or taste. If we do only saignée, we've experienced it in a few years. Because of the global warming impact, we're getting less and less juice in the berries. And so you need a bit more time for the saignée and the weight of the skin actually to push all that juice out. The more time you spend, the heavier the wines, the darker the color, etc. So the way we manage exactly the color and the taste profile is by combining press, lighter body, lighter color, with darker body, darker color. So that's for the Mussar jeune. For the Chateau Rosé, because it's mostly white grapes, 97% with a little bit of red, it's just a press of everything together. It's just a very slight hint of color from the Cinsault that we've included in there. And then the juice alone goes into fermentation in barrel.
Very cool. Very cool.
Unusual, but it makes amazing rosés.
On that same topic of the global warming side of things, what are some efforts that you're taking to adapt? I know you're talking about variety usage. Are you, like, when you're replanting, are you changing the root stocks? Are there other things that you're doing to evolve over time?
It's our biggest challenge by far. And we live in an area that has a lot of challenges, as you know, and they're not just linked to weather. They're linked to the whole geographical and political and military situation around us. But really, our biggest challenge is global warming. And so how do we adapt to it? Well, we plant more of the varietals when we have to replant. So we replant those that are susceptible to resist to heat. So we plant more Cinsault. We've started with Tempranillo 15 years ago. For that reason, we experiment with a few other varietals just to test. But for the moment, we haven't given them enough volume to create a new wine. It's just blended into others, but it's just, at least it gives us an idea to see how they behave. So this is the first part. The second part is that we're forced sometimes to harvest a little bit earlier than usual, because if you get a heat wave that hits you, and sometimes the heat wave can be 40, 42 Celsius, then you're going to have to run and, get 3 teams working together, which is what happened in 2015. To harvest everything at the same time. Otherwise, everything rots, because at 42 Celsius, your vines go into a survival mode, and so they don't care anymore about their clusters, and then just all of that will go away and be lost. So it's a challenge. So sometimes we start by harvesting a bit earlier, knowing that we might have to rush a little bit further down the season or the harvest season and rush everything into one shot because of the heat that gets in. And then the challenge is also at the winery, if you end up with higher sugar levels because of the extreme heat, when you're not using yeasts like we do, yes, you sometimes have fermentation that doesn't start, or it takes 2 days, and then you could lose the vat completely. So these are risks. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we haven't taken the step of changing our approach on that. It's a risk, but it's part of, I think, what defines our wines is this ability to create themselves on their own without needing inoculation from something else. That's part of the identity, and identity is key. It's the identity of the brand, the identity of the wines, the identity of our family. It's everything. It's what makes Mussar, or one of the things that makes Mussar.
100%. Marc, I think that's a good way to sum up Mussar. Singular in identity, but accessible enough, and especially the story that you're able to tell in the region, the varieties that you use, accessible enough to be, loved by people all around the world. So I wish you tons of success in continuing to create excellent wines and find people who love them. Come and visit maybe.
Yeah, of course. If people want to visit, we've had obviously a difficult last year and a half, but I think things are not completely settled, but almost. So we'll see how things go. But I think if people want to come and visit, it would be, perfect. And then Lebanon is a beautiful country. Lovely people, lovely food, lovely wine, very generous people. So it's worth a visit if you have an opportunity.
Yeah, our good friend Vince Anter, we saw his episode on V's for Vino about Lebanon, and he made it look amazing. So we'll definitely make a trip. But for now, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
No, my pleasure.
All right. That is our interview with Marc Hochar of Château Musar. I highly recommend everybody go seek out some of their wines, whether it is their top tier bottlings or any of the other ones. They're all super cool wines. I've had the pleasure of, since having my first one not too many months back, having a few of their wines across the range. And I will tell you can't really have an experience like Mussar. They are truly unique wines and something that needs to be experienced to be really understood. But for now, that is our episode for this week. We'll be back with another 5 questions on Friday and a full episode next week. Cheers.